Well, good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And I'm so glad to have Harley Schlanger joining us again from Potsdam, Germany, for another review of what's been going on with Harley. And Harley, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. We're going through a pretty tough winter here, and we have a new government, which is probably a step down from Merkel. So that tells you something.
Yeah, it sounds pretty horrific, actually. The things that I hear about it are frightening. And of course, what could say it better than Helga LaRouche's announcement this weekend? In a great big red banner on social media saying Germany must leave NATO. And I applaud that, 1,000 times. Is there any chance that Germany could leave NATO?
Well, it may have to, because if the situation gets more tense with Russia, what the German government knows very clearly is that if the US and Ukraine provoke an attack from Russia, it will have an impact immediately on the rest of Europe. And the first impact will probably be the Russians will cut off gas. I mean, that's one option they have. But if NATO is going to play a chicken game that it's going to fight with Russia, it's going to be bad for NATO. And, I think Biden knows that. Biden tried to take a couple baby steps back. And then what does Blinken do? Blinken goes and meets with the G7 foreign ministers. And he and the British foreign minister stand up there and wag their finger at Putin and threaten Russia, threaten that they'll kick Russia out of the international financial system. And, Russia has a fallback for that. It's not going to have as big a damage to Russia as it will to the international financial system. And then Blinken goes to South Asia and tries to get Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia to join the US in a crusade against China. We're not sure how that's working, but the Indonesians were among the most strong opposition to the COP26 conference. So here you have the US playing with an empty deck. It's got a pair of jokers, the British and NATO, and that's all they have in their hand. And the Russians are, in a sense, being very reasonable, saying, we have no intention of invading, but if you keep building up the forces on the Ukraine side of the Russian border, if you keep having overflights, in the last 3 days, there were 40 reconnaissance flights, 34 of which were with live pilots, not drones, up against the Russian borders from NATO. Last week, you had nuclear bomb carrying capable aircraft fly within 15 kilometers of the border, which means if they were actually in an attack formation, they'd be 5 minutes or less from a time that Moscow would have to decide whether to shoot or not. So there's a brinksmanship game coming from the West. And what Helga said is that you have on the one hand this complete neophyte, Annalena Baerbock, whose credentials are that she was a trampoline champ in Germany. She's educated at the London School of Economics. And when she speaks, it sounds like a printout of NATO and the Atlantic Council. And she's saying Germany has to upgrade its air force to be able to carry nuclear weapons in case of a war with Russia. Now, that's the kind of talk that starts getting Germans worried. It's bad enough we're not going to have electricity this winter, but then you add to that we may not have a country this winter. And I think we're beginning to see some panic. And so Helga released this statement, which is up on the Schiller Institute website, where she describes the war drive as psychopathic, echoing what Tulsi Gabbard said. And then she made the point, as you say, John, Germany has to get out of NATO if it wants to survive.
If it wants to survive, it has to get out of NATO. Well, looking back, the whole German, the West Germany, the Federal Republic, everything was pretty much created by the United States and shaped by our policymakers of the Cold War era. And that's why they put Reinhard Galen in charge of their Bundesnachrichtendienst. This guy's, he was, what it shows to me is that if you are in the intelligence game, it doesn't matter what side you're on. You're going to survive. You're going to be worthwhile because other intelligence people are going to take care of you somehow. It's like Five Eyes in a way, except for, wow, you just suddenly brought in the whole Nazi East European intelligence systems service and put it in charge of the whole German. I mean, really, they were basically running the government with Adenauer and everything. So there came a time when Helmut Kohl ran for, I guess it's called the chancellor in Germany, and he was supposedly, the first freely elected, but nevertheless, I don't know if there's ever really been a free election in Germany since World War II. Is that a fair point?
Well, there was one moment with Willy Brandt, and Willy Brandt was not a good guy, but Willy Brandt adopted something called Ostpolitik, East politics, where he essentially recognized that Germany could not have a hostile relationship with the Soviet Union because of the arms buildup that was going on between East and West, the deployment of the SS-20 missiles by the Russians, the US talking about neutron bombs and limited nuclear war with weapons based in Germany. And so Brandt held a hand out to the East, and Schmidt, who followed Brandt, continued somewhat of a limited détente policy, but he had actually a fairly interesting idea for the European economic integration, which was not the same as what we have today with the European Union. Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing of France had an idea which was somewhat based on de Gaulle's idea of a Europe of the fatherlands, that is a federation, but in which nation states play the leading role. And he was setting up a European monetary fund on that basis. But the plug got pulled on it by London. And you remember that you had Maggie Thatcher come in. Kohl was there when the wall came down. And Kohl realized that he was having to deal with Thatcher, Mitterrand, and Bush Sr. And they had an intent, which was to get the best possible deal they could from the crumbling Soviet empire in return for the Soviets accepting unification of Germany. But even with Kohl and even with Bush Sr., in February 1990, Baker met with Gorbachev, James Baker, Secretary of State, who's part of this whole Dulles type network, a corporate lawyer, a longtime Bush crony. But what he said in the meeting with Gorbachev is he promised NATO would not move 1 inch further eastward. Now, Gorbachev probably isn't a lawyer and didn't get it in writing. And so the US is now saying, well, we never made a written agreement not to move eastward. And I think there are 16 or 17 new countries that have been added to NATO since that pledge was made. And now they're talking about adding 2 more, Georgia and Ukraine. And so Putin finally laid down the marker. He said, look, we have to get a written guarantee of no further expansion. And Biden's reaction to him was, well, we don't accept red lines, because Putin said that's a red line. And then Blinken said, we don't believe that any other country should dictate to another country what their policy should be. Now, I wonder if Blinken ever listens to what he says. How often does the United States dictate what a nation's policy should be? And if they don't go along, what happens? Regime change. They're still threatening that against Russia and China. So, the hypocrisy of the idea that there's one model and it's our model, and that's the rules-based order. People in Germany are going to have to make a decision. And in the past, the Germans went along with the British and NATO because Germany was prosperous. Adenauer had an economic policy which built up the physical economy in Germany, but it's deteriorating badly. I mean, I can just tell you, driving around Potsdam, it actually should be called Pothole Dam. You can't get to the train station. I live 20-minute walk from the train station. It takes 40 minutes to drive there because of the construction and how long it takes, the terrible job they do of rerouting roads. The electricity costs have gone up 40% in the last 2 months in Germany because of the exit of coal and nuclear. So Germany's facing a moment of decision. Is it going to stay loyal to the British system, which says you can't get gas from Russia, you can't trade with China, or will they try and cut a separate deal? And what Helga's emphasizing is all this war talk about Russia and China. She called it, I think, a storm of confetti to cover up the fact that the Western system, the transatlantic system, is going into bankruptcy. And they're using this to distract people's attention. So I think if people get that as a background picture, the German political situation is very terrible right now. But look, there have been sudden changes in Germany and France and Italy that have taken place in the past. That could happen again.
I think we were gifted a present by Putin this weekend when he and Russia vetoed a UN resolution that would have tied climate change to international security. And
yeah,
I see that. I mean, I didn't know that was even being raised. The issue was being raised, but we've, the UN looks to me to be kind of a power in waiting. It's sitting there waiting for a chance to send the blue helmets out. I am afraid of the UN. The UN has all of this power through these, UNESCO and all of these other things. Why should we be trying to tie climate change to international security? I mean, obviously, there's the specious argument that, hey, if the Earth builds up, if the Earth burns up from climate change, then we all lose. But setting that nonsense aside, what's the real reason that the West wants to tie climate change to international security?
Well, this has to do with the idea of a unipolar world. And this goes back to 1990. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, remember, President Bush spoke of a new world economic order. And what he meant was the primacy of the free trade neoliberal system that had come on with a muscular version since Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. The deregulation, the privatization, the granting of total freedom and power to the private banking system and the private cartels. That, as you know, John, goes back to the dreams of the 1920s, when the cartels, actually even before that, with the monopoly developments, the international cartels that helped put Hitler in power. The fight at the end of World War II was, would we have a world order in which sovereign nations traded with other sovereign nations on a fair basis? Or would there be a global neoliberal free trade system? And although Roosevelt's full Bretton Woods package was vetoed, there was enough of it there that enabled most of the world to grow between 1948 and say 1965. But with the assassination of Kennedy, there was a profound shift. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this idea of a unipolar world was that the so-called rules-based order would be based on rules that would benefit the City of London and Wall Street. And the European Union was brought in as a partner of that. So we have the offshore tax havens, the global courts that are run by the corporate cartels, the financial agreements that depend now entirely on what happens with the dollar and what happens in the City of London with the price of gold and the spot markets. we have basically a speculative swindler's paradise, which is destroying much of the economy of the world. And the Green New Deal is the next phase of that, to, by diktat, shut down physical economic production, investment into real goods production, into advances in the science and technology going into goods production, energy production, transportation, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about the Russian veto is, let's just take a look at what happened at the end of last week with the Summit of Hypocrisy. I'm sorry, the Summit of Democracy. What they are based on is a project that grew out of the State Department Policy Planning Committee that was then picked up by the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council set up something called the D10 Committee, which was what Boris Johnson was trying to implement at the G7 event that took place in the United Kingdom last summer. The D10 basically says that the G7 is inadequate as a global platform for control. The UN doesn't work because the UN Security Council gives China and Russia veto powers. The UN as a whole doesn't work because it's too big. The G20 doesn't function because there are too many countries that don't go along with the unilaterals. So what they tried to set up was an agreement to have a platform run by 30 so-called democratic nations, which would basically mean the United States, Great Britain, and the European Union, dictating all economic terms, whether it's climate, whether it's strategic, whether it's pandemic or economic investment, and so on. And the D10 Strategy Forum has been wildly setting up all over the world think tanks, strategy sessions, podcasts. And one of the things they said is that we need to have a global exchange system which is climate friendly. And so they're trying to tie currency transactions to the Green New Deal, which means no credit will go into production, no credit into research and development. And so this is what there's another one, strategy of constrainment, the Atlantic Council. So what you have is an effort to isolate Russia and China, which are the two leading countries that don't go along with this, and to dictate terms to countries like India that tend to be influenced very much by Russia and even China. But to say to them, if you want to be outside of the world order, then you can stay with the authoritarian countries, but we want you in as the democracies. Now, India is not really going along with it. South Africa didn't agree with it. Indonesia was not too keen on it, because what most of the world sees is that this is an attempt to set up a new geopolitical division based on this idea that the powerful countries can dictate the rules-based order. And as Blinken said at the Democracy Summit, we have the economic power, the military power, and the moral power to enforce this. Now, I think what we're seeing with the situation in Ukraine is that many people doubt that the United States still possesses the military power to enforce its order unless they're prepared to go to a nuclear war. And that's going to end up playing into the hands of Russia and China, who are basically saying, let's come up with some agreements. Let's come up with some ideas we can agree upon in terms of how to deal with Ukraine. And Putin has a strong hand here. The United States, France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine were part of a process that led to what's called the Normandy format, which is Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine, where they had a conference in Minsk, and they agreed that the Ukrainians should give some autonomy to the people in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, which is largely Russian ethnic. And they're very worried about the neo-Nazis in Kiev who are trying to impose a top-down ethnic cleansing into eastern Ukraine. That's why Russia provided some military help, some arms to protect them. And what Putin said to Biden is, why won't you insist that Ukraine abide by the agreement they signed on eastern Ukraine? So Biden, interestingly, in the summit, said he would propose a meeting with the major NATO powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, to talk with Russia about NATO expansion, not to give Russia a veto, but to discuss it. And one of Biden's people said it's probably going to be 10 years before Ukraine qualifies anyway. But then Blinken contradicted that, saying we could have a fast track for Ukraine membership in NATO. So Blinken is actually undercutting what Biden is saying, or else they're just letting Biden say what he wants, and Blinken represents the policy. And secondly, Biden agreed that he would talk to Ukraine about the Normandy format and the Minsk agreement. We'll see, because in Kiev, the neo-Nazis are flexing their muscles. They're sending more units of the Azov battalion and the right sector troops onto the border of the Donbass. They now have drones provided to them by Turkey, and they're prepared to launch a strike into eastern Ukraine. If that happens, it's most likely the Russians will have some kind of response, and it will probably be a sharp military response at the heart of the Ukraine military, which is not very powerful. Then the question comes up, will NATO back them up? Now, Biden told Putin that he does not intend to deploy US troops into Ukraine. Well, what happens if the D10 countries, the European countries, and Biden's own advisors say, we don't want to look weak to Putin, so we have to send something? Well, then you're on the verge of nuclear war. And that's the real danger. And so the whole climate thing, it's just a part of a strategy for a global dictatorship.
Yeah, thanks. I now that you've unwrapped it for me, I see it. I see it clearly. It's all part of the Green New Deal, and that all has to do with the failing financial system in the West. It's apparent to me that China, at least on paper, can get by on its own. It doesn't need the West, doesn't need outside help. It seems like they're doing pretty good. Everything seems to be getting more and more valuable in China, and real estate, the capitalist instinct is strong among the Chinese people. And this is a lot of people, and they're going to keep on growing their economy. They're not in debt. This country, the United States, is deeply, deeply, deeply in debt. And that's a big difference between us. Russia, I don't know, but I don't think that they have any significant debt to worry about.
They have a very small foreign debt. The Russians have a very small foreign debt.
So why do they need us anyway? Well, either China or Russia. Is there something that they need other than to just be left alone and stop pointing those nuclear missiles at us?
Well, the strength of the Chinese economy was largely due to the agreements that began with Nixon, and then the Deng Xiaoping reforms, and then the bringing China into the World Trade Organization. And what happened is that China accepted the terms initially of the global cartels because it meant they could invest in their physical economy and export goods to the United States. And the United States became China's largest export market. And so they made a lot of dollars from that, and that built up their economy. Now, they still have a lot of trade with the United States, and there's still goods and things that we produce that the Chinese want. The idea of a decoupling is not something that the Chinese want, because they still want to have the potential benefits of trade. On the other hand, they're being accused of using trade as a way of stealing US secrets, when the fact is, if you look at the number of patents that were granted in the last 2 years, the Chinese vastly outnumber new patents coming from compared to the US. They are advancing in hypersonic weapons, space exploration, high-speed rail. They're doing things now, including clean coal, that we're not doing in the West. And the United States still is dependent to a certain extent on supply chains related to China. Now, the best of all possible worlds would be trade agreements. And when all is said and done, Trump was working on certain kinds of directionality with China. that was very bumpy, very rough, but was making progress until the question of COVID came up. And then Bannon sold President Trump on the political expedient scenario is to develop the narrative that China used COVID as a weapon against the United States. And that broke the potential for moving ahead with the trade deal. But the other thing to realize about China is that while they profited initially from joining the World Trade Organization and from the outsourcing of US and Western manufacturing in China, as their economy started growing, there were demands to improve the standard of living of Chinese workers, which the Chinese government did. They started insisting on better wages, on better conditions for healthcare and other things. So the costs went up. And the corporate cartels didn't like that. And so you started getting these stories that China is trying to overtake us economically to become the global superpower. And that's the line that comes from the Davos billionaires, that we now have to stop China, the so-called Thucydides trap, that when one country becomes more powerful than another country, there's almost always a war. Well, that doesn't have to be. Why does China improving the standard of living of its people mean that we have to engage in cutthroat competition and possibly war with them? There are many ways you could get around that, including mutually beneficial trade. China keeps offering the United States, join us in the Belt and Road initiatives. Let's have three-way deals in Africa and South Asia. And Obama's response to that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership to exclude China. Whereas the Chinese set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and offered the participation to all the Western countries. Germany agreed, France agreed, Sweden agreed, other countries agreed, and Obama was viciously opposed to it. And then Obama had from his State Department staff this idea of the pivot to Asia, that we have to have a robust US response to China because China's out to get us now. And that's where the whole thing with China started. It was before Trump, it was Obama. It was the team around Blinken and Jake Sullivan and this guy Ash Jain, who was at the State Department, who's now running the D10 project at the Atlantic Council. He was working with Blinken on this pivot to Asia. So you had a whole crew of these guys who defined a new geopolitical strategy of transatlantic countries versus Russia and China. Now, there's no reason for this. There's no reason we couldn't continue mutually beneficial trade and investment policy. We do have to deal with the problem of debt in the United States. We have to deal with the problem of a hollowed out manufacturing sector. So why is that China's fault? It was our corporate cartels that adopted the policy and shut down American industry, that pushed privatization of healthcare, privatization of infrastructure. We did it to ourselves. We can't blame China for that.
That all gets right back to what I think is probably the biggest misconception in our culture today, and that is this idea of sovereign nations acting as one and entering into the international arena as a single sovereign mind, to say China's going to do this, Russia is going to do this, America's going to do this. America did this and it's all America's fault. Russia did this and it's all Russia's fault. The thing that I find over and over again is that there are internal conflicts in this country. There's internal conflicts around the world. Internal conflicts, I'm sure, exist in China, although I don't study it well enough to know. But this point is that in our country, we have people that are completely against our foreign policy, and we just get shut out. And I'm wondering about the people of, I was going to make a point about Ukraine. Let me just go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
a few days ago, I said something about the Azov battalion and how can our so-called liberal Democrats support anything that involves these people with the double lightning bolts on their shoulders and the SS symbols. How is it possible for a Chuck Schumer or anybody with a liberal reputation to say, yeah, we should go ahead and support these guys? It's a horrible idea. Well, I got some feedback, and I think it's worth passing on, and that is that in World War II, millions and millions of Ukrainians fought against the Nazis, and that's what I think we need to say is that I can emphasize about Bandera and Azov and the Privy sector and all of these horrible things that we get. But the fact is that if 10 or 15 or 20,000 Ukrainians fought for the Nazis, 3 to 5 million Ukrainians fought for Soviet Russia. I mean, it was part of Russia at the time, but they were also Ukrainians, and they were fighting against these Nazis. So that's an example of what I'm trying to say generally, is that it's not right to blame China for what the Chinese government does. It's not right to blame Russia, and it's not right to blame the United States. I think the United States has got to divorce itself from the banking industry. I mean, the same kind of a pie in the sky hope that Germany could divorce itself from NATO. If we could just unwrap ourselves from the financial entanglements that we've been thrust into without our permission, without democratic votes, without any type of popular desire to borrow all this money and make all of these boondoggle weapons. A lot of them we'll never know about them. They were made by DARPA in Area 51 for $10 billion someday, and we'll never know what they did with it. It's all money that's just getting poured away and poured away. But our government is so captured by the banks, and it has been for so long. I mean, I'm starting to realize, we got into World War I and World War II, mainly, I think, in order to support our financial interests of our big banks and the Rockefellers and all. So it's not just one country's problem, it's the world's problem. Like I was saying about Five Eyes before, and I'm reading a book about the history of the FBI in World War II, and I had never known that just like our FBI and OSS were separate and different from each other and actually contended a lot during the war, MI5 and MI6 were also at loggerheads. And MI6, being the foreign branch, was along with the American CIA guys, the Dulles guys, but the MI5 guys were more in tune with Hoover and the old guard real value economy. So I think
MI5
the transition.
MI5 had responsibility for rooting out Nazi sabotage networks inside Britain. And they were actually, in that sense, fighting the war. MI6 was involved with trying to make sure the post-war era would be favorable to the City of London. And MI6 has always been much closer to the City of London. Now, that's not to say MI5 is good, just like today the FBI is a scurrilous operation from what we can see from Russiagate. But to get to your bigger point there, Ukraine had the misfortune of being in Central Europe. And you had the ongoing battle directed from Britain to prevent Germany and the Soviet Union from having any kind of positive relationship. This is the whole point of Mackinder's geopolitics. You have to separate Western Europe from Eurasia if you wish to sustain the global power of the British Empire. And today, what you're talking about with the bankers, this is a modern version of the old British Empire, free trade, and so on. It comes all from the City of London. And, in the case of Ukraine, the reason to focus on something like the Azov battalion and the Banderistas is that they willingly joined the Nazi SS. And they weren't just fighting against the Soviets who were in control of Ukraine at the time. They were killing Romanians, Hungarians, Russians, Jews. They were conducting mass murder. And they said they were doing it in the interest of an ethnically pure Ukraine. Now, when you bring up Schumer, I can't imagine that Schumer has not been briefed on the fact that some of the weapons, the Javelin, for example, anti-tank missile launchers that we just provided to Ukraine, are going to be in the hands of people from the Azov battalion. He's got to know that. Obviously, they're operating from this strategic perspective that we've got to destroy Putin, and therefore anyone who's against Putin should be our ally. And this is where you see the effects of geopolitics. What are the real interests of the United States in Europe? Obviously, peace. Obviously, a European, Asian, Eurasian perspective for which the United States is well situated to be a partner. But instead, we're saying, no, we can't allow other powers to control the economic terms. And I just want to mention one other thing before we have to go, which is on this question of who makes the rules. The last couple of days, I've been very much focused on what happened last Friday in London, where the appeals court ruled for the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. Now, here you have Blinken and Biden and others last week talking about democracy versus authoritarianism. And we've been sanctioning Russia over and over and over, including for the Navalny case. Now, in the Navalny case, there's a videotape that shows Navalny's lieutenant meeting with people from the British embassy, asking for millions of dollars to help them undermine Putin's government. And that's why the Russians cracked down on Navalny, because he was operating on behalf of a foreign intelligence agency. In the case of Assange, there's no such evidence that he was working for any other foreign power. What he did was he published documents that were given to him from the war criminals in the military and the defense and intelligence agencies who were conducting these never-ending wars. He produced them so that there would be transparency, so that we could end these wars. And for that, they're out to kill him. And this ruling in London last week is extremely dangerous. Now, it appears it's going to take maybe 1.5 to 2 years for an appeals process. Meanwhile, he's dying in the prison. So here we have Blinken ranting and raving about Russian autocracy and authoritarianism and shutting down free press and shutting down free speech. What happened in the Assange case? What happened in the case of all the whistleblowers who have come forward and been arrested, especially by the Obama administration? So when you look at that, you see that this is not about extending human rights and democracy. It's about ending the opposition to a unilateral world order, which includes a central banker's financial dictatorship called the Great Reset, and a dictatorship over what is allowed in science and technology called the Green New Deal. And that's why I think the Ukraine issue, you take it into the larger context and you see that it perfectly fits. And you have fights now all over Europe against governments surrendering their sovereignty to the European Union. Throughout the developing sector, you have countries rebelling against the International Monetary Fund, the economic hitmen, and so on. And if we're really about freedom, we have to do what you suggested, John, which is start with this point that we have to unwrap the tentacles of the bankers, the private bankers, the corporate cartels, from the stranglehold they have on government. They control the government now. They control the institutions, the think tanks, but they don't control the minds of the people. And we've just got to get the minds of the people up to snuff on what's actually happening so that they're capable of resisting in the most effective way.
Well, I don't know how to improve on that statement. That's exactly right. We're desperately trying to get the word out and let let people know that mainstream media is not your friend. That they will lie to you. These television and mainstream media outlets are poisoning our government, our ability to participate in the government. And then we get all spun out on fighting on things that really don't have to do with foreign policy or banking policy or anything like that. We've got tremendous controversy going on over the alleged pandemic and the
Critical race
questionable
theory.
treatment, therefore.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
And critical race
Well, I
theory,
don't know about
gender.
I've heard the phrase. I've heard, yeah, but it's going crazy, isn't it? I mean, I don't pay any attention to it. Critical race theory doesn't affect me, but it does affect kids going to school. It does affect parents. It does affect people that watch television, and it's a great wedge issue. It's a great way to drive a wedge. If you believe in this critical race theory, well, okay, maybe there's something to it. I'm not going to say it's completely wrong or anything. I haven't really studied it. But on the other hand, once you go there, then you start to judge other people differently. You judge people
You get
based upon
divided
what you
into
learned.
smaller and smaller groups. That's what identity politics is. They don't want you to think about what does it mean to have quantitative easing for 3 years with 20-something trillion dollars going into the pockets of the wealthiest people in the world. They don't want you to think about that. They want you to think that you may be losing out because there's some theory that elevates African Americans above white Americans. They play on the fear that people are going to lose something. And then they carry out policies that actually seem to carry that out. And so, if you can divide people up so they're missing the big picture, like Ukraine, I mean, there's very little discussion of what's really happening around Ukraine and what really happened with the Biden-Putin summit, outside of this idea that Putin is demanding something of Biden and the Republicans are saying Biden's not tough enough. You have people like this Senator Wicker from Mississippi who are saying we should rain down bombs on the Russians and if necessary, use first strike nuclear force. And I was very proud to see Tulsi Gabbard come out and say that that's psychopathic. Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was brought into the Pentagon at the end of his term by Trump, McGregor came out and said, we would lose a war in Ukraine. This is completely insane. As you know, John, we've been very much out front on trying to warn people about this, but more people have to speak out. And that's the only way you can fight this stuff.
Well, I thought I'd let you see a little bit of the hills out here in the Shenandoah Valley, where my wife and I have snuck away for a couple of days, and that's why we are looking a little different for folks today. But it's beautiful out here. The Shenandoah River is right down below us. You can't see it, but sometimes you can hear it rippling along. We walked down there yesterday. It's really a beautiful place out here in the Shenandoah Valley to get away for a few days. So just wanted to share that with you for a minute before we wrap up the show.
Well, I hiked through the Shenandoah Valley many, many years ago with my family. We took a vacation to Virginia Beach, and then we drove back to West Virginia through that part of Virginia, and it was really beautiful.
Well, I trust everyone's feeling better now. We talked a few weeks ago and you had some illness in your family. I hope everyone's doing better.
Well, we're still battling it a little bit. And, when they basically quarantined my daughter's class because there were some kids who tested positive. So I have all 3 kids at home full time. So it's a little nerve wracking.
Okay.
I sort of feel like I'm facing
very
Russian
much
tanks every morning.
Oh God, yeah. You talk about divide and conquer, and when I look, as I told you, I've been studying like crazy for some reason. Just got fascinated on the Eastern Front in World War II, and you see the German pincer movement coming out, and they circled around the Russians and they create this pocket, and it's like the Ruzhev pocket or the Donbass pocket or some pocket. And then they gradually, they just divide it. They just divide it in half, and then they divide it in quarters. And then the units that they're defending just get smaller and smaller till they give up. That is the theory, I think, not only in warfare, but also in politics, to keep us encircled, keep a circle around us financially. So we, you can't move, you can't leave your job. You don't have the options of escaping or, move to California and start over. You can't do that kind of thing anymore. So you're stuck. But that is, if you have an opinion that's not part of the narrative, then you can bet that there's going to be a way to divide you from your neighbors or your friends or even your family. At this point, it's an intentional dissolution of our culture, our families, our society, and that hurts. It hurts really bad, and we've got to stop it. So,
John,
and I know you feel exactly the same.
It's a form of psychological warfare to shrink our purview, to shrink our sense of the world. And I think the most effective thing, and I know this is what you do, is that if you fight to find the higher truth always, and cut through the confetti that's flying around. But once you find a method of doing that, share that with others and be joyful about it instead of being constrained by the fact that most people around you are being brainwashed by the media. Help them see that. There was an old joke about a section of East Germany called Saxony, where they called it the Valley of the Clueless because it was a valley and they couldn't get Western television. And it was, when they finally got Western television, when the wall came down, they had no idea what the world was like. And, I think someday people in the United States will wake up and realize that when you have a John Brennan and a James Clapper as expert commentators on MSNBC and CNN, there's a reason for that. You're being subjected to brainwashing. And as soon as people realize that, they're liberated, but then they have to have the desire to find the truth. And the best place to look is to study the history of our nation, study the philosophical traditions, which go back to ancient Greece, study the history of Europe, and then come to realize that we have a special heritage that we have to fight for. And I'm not talking about a racial heritage, I'm talking about a philosophical outlook.
That's right. And it's nice to have fellow warriors such as yourself, Harley. Thank you very much for this morning, and thanks for all the work that you do at the Schiller Institute. I also want to particularly thank Andy Dabala and the Neighborhood News Studio for producing this show this morning, and they deserve your support as well. So always reach out to Neighborhood News Studio and see what they're up to. They've got George Webb over there, Dr. Tarver, Professor Hamamoto, as well as myself, and it's a growing outlet. Highly recommend that you check it out. Okay, Harley Schlanger, thank you so much for this morning, and be well. I trust your family will continue to improve, and we'll get through this winter. Spring will come, as they say. The flowers will rise into spring.
As Shelley said, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?
Amen to that. Thanks very much. Thanks
again,
again,
John.
Harley. Thanks, Andy.